Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Do you remember when football players wore stickum? Do you remember when the NBA played defense? Do you remember when Wrigley Field turned on the lights? If so, then this podcast is for you. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together. We're here to discuss iconic sports moments, teams, and athletes from our generation. This is GenX Classic Sports, sports talk for Gen Xers by Gen Xers.
All right, so you ready?
Sure.
Okay, welcome to episode 8. I've got a special guest with me today who's an 18-year-old future sports journalist, and he happens to be my kid Dylan. So Dylan, say hello.
Hello.
And the reason we're doing this episode is because Dylan brought me the idea originally. He brought me an idea for something else, and when I did the research on it, it sort of led into the topic for episode 8. So what Dylan wanted to talk about originally was the 1989 NFL draft. And as I started researching that, I realized that there's actually, since we're in Arkansas, there's actually another story that sort of precedes and leads into the story of the 1989 draft. And Dylan said, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'm gonna talk to him and you about it out there, and we're gonna learn some stuff about an event that I was very much aware of when it happened. So Dylan, based on all of our likes and teams and favorite players and so forth, we decided to do, as you wanted, the 1989 draft. But when I started researching it, I realized that just as much of an interesting story really was the 1989 Cotton Bowl. And I found that to be a good fit because here we are in Arkansas, and you're a student up there. And we're in the middle of football season, a lot of exciting things going on. So it's hard to talk about the 1989 NFL draft and all the stuff surrounding that like you wanted to without first talking about the 89 Cotton Bowl. So let me set the stage. Well, first of all, what do you know about the 1989 Cotton Bowl? By the way, everybody, it's pretty obvious that Dylan he's Gen Z. And the cool thing about Gen Z people like Dylan who are into pop culture is that our Gen X childhood back to the 70s and certainly into the 80s and 90s is really accessible to these kids in living color and stereo sound via YouTube. We didn't have that. Gen X had reruns, and that missed a whole lot of things. So Dylan has grown up around me seeing a lot about the 80s, sports, movies, television, and music. And so Dylan's no stranger to a lot of the topics that we talk about. It's just he didn't live through them like we did. So Dylan, you're going to learn a little bit today, but you do know some of this. So what do you know about the Cotton Bowl from 1989?
Just that it was between UCLA and Arkansas.
And how do you know it was between UCLA and Arkansas?
Because he told me.
Because I told you. Okay. So, all right. So, yes, in 1989, the Cotton Bowl used to be played. Well, yeah, it was played in what they called the old Cotton Bowl Stadium in Dallas. Okay. UCLA had a quarterback that you've heard of. Do you know who that might be?
Troy Aikman.
Troy Aikman. That's correct. And so what happened was Aikman was your prototypical drop-back passing quarterback for UCLA, but how he got there is even another mini story. In the early 80s, Aikman was a well-known quarterback and I think baseball catcher, perhaps, out of Henrietta, Oklahoma. And he was drafted. He was recruited to play football at Oklahoma. He actually was going there to run the option and the wishbone, which most Gen X sports fans know all about that, the wishbone and the option. He was going to Oklahoma to do that for who was the coach, Dylan?
Barry Switzer.
That's correct. And in 1984, Aikman shows up on campus, and he was the first true freshman quarterback Oklahoma had starting at quarterback since World War II. So it was a big deal, okay? And Aikman, even though he was a big guy, he was about 6'3", 220 plus, big guy, prototypical size for a pro quarterback, very much in that Terry Bradshaw type of mold or whatever. The thing about Aikman was he could run. The guy was a great athlete. So he went to Oklahoma to run the wishbone. He did. And so what happened was he actually broke his ankle in a big game, okay? So when he broke his ankle, another guy took over, and I believe it was 85, the championship season of 85, and the guy's name was Jamel Holloway. And he ran the wishbone to perfection, as they say. Aikman didn't really have a team to come back to after they won a national title with Holloway, but it wasn't really a bitter parting with Switzer, because Switzer helped him find the best program. Back then, the transfer rules were very stringent. You know, when you transferred, you had to sit out. And so Switzer found the coach and the program that he thought Aikman should go to, and that was UCLA. So he transfers to UCLA to play for a guy named Terry Donahue, and they ran what I call a prototypical pro-style offense: drop back passing, running game, so forth. Okay, so you're with me on all that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he transfers to UCLA, and UCLA promptly goes 20 wins and 4 losses with his 2 seasons as a starter. Now, back then, the college football season was how many games?
I have no idea.
Okay, so back then it was 11 games. They play 12 now. They made an exception to that several years ago and bumped the schedule up to 12 games. But Aikman was playing in 11-game seasons, and there was no playoffs, so you got your 11 games plus a bowl game.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So coming into his final season for UCLA after sitting out and then starting a couple years, coming into his final season, Aikman was hyped up big time for the Heisman Trophy, which would have been the regular season of 1988. I was a senior in high school. Aikman would have been, I guess, a senior at UCLA. And he was hyped up along with another quarterback who played on his biggest rival's team, and they were both hyped up preseason as Heisman finalists. Do you have any idea who that guy might have been?
Who was it?
Who's their biggest rival?
USC?
USC. Do you know who USC's quarterback was?
Not at the time.
Rodney Peete.
Hmm.
So Aikman and Rodney Peete are getting all the preseason coverage, and UCLA and USC are kind of duking it out for what's going to be the Pac-10 title back then. So they were getting Heisman attention for sure, especially Aikman. By the way, we now know that they both lost that Heisman to whom?
Barry Sanders.
Correct, because he had how many yards rushing?
2,600.
Yeah, he had about 2,600.
Which stood forever and might get broken this year.
Yeah, we have a guy at Boise State right now doing a good job of trying to demolish that record that I thought would never fall.
He's on pace right now, and he's averaging 10 yards a carry.
He's on pace, averaging 10 yards a carry, right. So we'll see if that sticks, but that's an incredible record nonetheless. So Aikman, let's go back to Aikman. He's 11-1, or he's 10-1, goes to a bowl game his junior year, or the first year he starts, and he wins. Comes back as a senior, goes 10-1. The only problem was they were the preseason hype, them or USC, to actually win the Pac-10. Now, where does the Pac-10 winner back then traditionally always play their bowl game?
Coliseum?
Well, no, but where? Well, USC's home field is the Coliseum. UCLA's home field is the Rose Bowl. But what bowl game did the Pac-10 winner always get the seeding to?
Rose Bowl?
They always played yes. Okay, so the question was UCLA or USC, who is going to the Rose Bowl? Well, along the way, Aikman lost 2 conference games in '88, and one of those was to USC in the big shootout at the end of the season. So actually, UCLA was upset earlier in the season by Washington State, okay? Mm-hmm. So the game with USC, they still had an outside shot to make it, but USC also beat them. And what's weird about that is, from what I remember, Rodney Peete was actually sick or injured or something, and I don't think he played in that game, and they still upset Aikman and them. So Aikman's sitting here. He's actually when I said earlier that he was 10-1 both seasons, he was I guess 9-2 as a senior, because he lost to Washington State and he lost to Rodney Peete and USC. So, by winning over UCLA, USC got the bid to the Rose Bowl. And the Cotton Bowl had already negotiated with the Pac-10. And for the first time, they said, look, we will take your runner-up in the Cotton Bowl to play the Southwest Conference champion. So that's what happened. USC upset UCLA. USC went to the Rose. That left UCLA second place with a 9-2 record, going to the Cotton Bowl against what turned out to be the Arkansas Razorbacks. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that game against USC was really like a pick'em type situation. It was a complete toss up over who was going to win that game, most likely. Now, so that's how UCLA got there. First, they got their quarterback. Their quarterback was matched up perfectly with their coordinator and head coach and their philosophy. And that leaves you with the Southwest Conference champion, Arkansas Razorbacks. Okay, so Dylan, do you know anything about the Razorbacks from that 1988 regular season by any chance?
Besides that, they had a bunch of players drafted, including Steve Atwater. Not really.
Okay, so do you know who their play-by-play and color analysts are on the radio right now?
Maybe if you said their names.
Quinn Grovey is the color analyst, and he was a quarterback for Arkansas back then. And Quinn Grovey still on the radio as their analyst, and that was the team that he was a part of that team. So let me tell you, let's set the stage for Arkansas. So do you have any idea who the coach would have been in 1988?
No, that's too early for.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting ahead of you there for sure. That was Ken Hatfield's 5th season, and Ken Hatfield took over for Lou Holtz 5 years earlier. All right. In 1984, Ken Hatfield took over for Lou Holtz. Coming into the Cotton Bowl that year, Arkansas also had they ended up with a 10-2 record, but they had 2 big losses in the regular season. I'm sorry, 1 big loss in the regular season. Before I get to that, though, let me back up. Do you know what offense Arkansas ran that everybody was kind of famous for back then? I told you the answer when I was talking about Oklahoma.
Wishbone.
They ran the wishbone. They ran a version of the wishbone that Ken Hatfield was a big champion of, and that was called the flex bone, and that basically meant they could break the bone formation up and have another receiver or whatever. It was more flexible, so they call it the flex bone. Okay, so Arkansas that season, they started out 7-0. Okay, and the Southwest Conference and everything, so they're rolling, right? So they had been ranked as high as top 10 in the country at different times. They started the season went through the season not only 7-0 in the Southwest Conference. They also played their final game of the year against. Do you have any idea what national matchup they had the 11th game of the season by any chance? They were 10-0 going into the final game of the year. So obviously they're undefeated in the Southwest Conference, and they had this one extra game that was a big showdown game for them, and it was the final game of the season. You know who that was?
Was it a Southwest team?
No, it was a national matchup. It wasn't a Southwest Conference.
Was it Miami?
It was Miami. That's a good guy. That was the Miami. Not only was it a game against Miami, it was the second half of a 2-game stretch against Miami. So do you know anything about the Miami game from the season before by any chance?
No, I don't. Was it Jimmy Johnson still?
That's right, and that's its own story too that we won't get into today. But so the season before, Arkansas also had a good team. And I know these things have to happen years and years in advance. Somehow or another, being the athletic director, I'm sure Frank Broyles ended up scheduling the Miami Hurricanes. And I don't know if they scheduled that while Jimmy was the head coach or Jimmy inherited that schedule. Somebody that's a huge Razorback fan and knows all these things can tell me. But the year before, Miami rolled into Little Rock to play the Razorbacks. And do you know what happened in that game by any chance?
I'd assume that Miami blew them out.
Miami blew them out like 51 or 2-7, I think, something like that.
That's a total mismatch.
And the reason that was such a big deal, really, is because it was an emotional thing between Jimmy Johnson and Frank Broyles. Because years before, not only when Holtz got hired, but I'm pretty sure when Hatfield got hired too, Jimmy thought he had the job both of those times. I think he was an assistant or head coach at other schools, and being a former Razorback and playing for Broyles, I think he thought they would give him a fair shot at becoming the coach. And it turns out he didn't get the job, and it really upset him. And so when they ended up on the schedule against each other, when I tell you, he tried to beat Arkansas as hard as he could in War Memorial and Little Rock. Trust me on that. Mm-hmm. So it ended up being 52-7. Michael Irvin got drafted to the Cowboys as their first-round pick, and Jimmy comes back the next year at Miami. And so now they're scheduling the second half of that series, and Arkansas has to play at Miami. I remember watching that game, and the important thing about that game is how close it was. You have any idea what the score could have been for a 1988 national top 10? Both teams were in the top 10. You have any idea what the score might have been?
I would like to say that it was low scoring, but I think
it was.
It actually was?
Yeah, it was fairly low scoring. It was a typical 80s style game, maybe even a little underscored by 80s standards.
There's no telling them.
It was 18-16 Miami, and Arkansas was in that game all the way and had a shot. If I may be wrong, I need Wayne Pumphrey to tell me different, but I want to say Steve Atwater perhaps dropped an interception that would have maybe turned things around. I can't remember. I just have that in my head. That may not have happened, but somebody will correct me. But yeah, on a nationally televised game, which we've gone over and over on this show, how difficult it is to, back then, how difficult it was to even get a nationally televised game. Arkansas did pretty well, and it really didn't hurt them that much in the national consciousness, I guess, because they ended up going into the Cotton Bowl. You want to take a stab at what Arkansas, after going 10-1 and only losing by 2 on the road to top 10 Miami, you want to take a stab at what they might have been ranked going into the Cotton Bowl as Southwest Conference champions?
Somewhere top 10.
They were number 10 in the country. Bingo. And I don't know, I have everything else on these notes that I'm looking at except where UCLA was ranked coming into the game. It's safe to say they were probably in the top 10 or top 15, but I'm not positive. Anyway, so Arkansas's number 10, UCLA's whatever they were, and it was a pretty good matchup. And so you got 10-1 against 9-2. Good matchup. Now, the reason that this is important and worth talking about before you even talk about the 1989 draft is that we always joke on here that that all roads seem to lead through Arkansas when national champions are crowned in NBA, NFL, Major League, all these big memorable moments, especially from GenX. Every time we talk about them, we seem to always find a thread that goes back to Arkansas, which is really bizarre. But anyway, obviously Arkansas was a thread in this one because they were participating in the game, but that's not the only reason. So with the Cotton Bowl being in Dallas, what they do, or what they did, and they probably still do, is they assign each team a different hotel and each team a different practice facility, right?
Yeah.
And so there's so many fields and places around Dallas. Arkansas was assigned to somewhere. I can't remember if they said it was SMU or where, but somewhere like that to go do their practicing. Guess where UCLA was scheduled to do all of their workouts the several days leading up to the Cotton Bowl?
Probably something Cowboys related.
Texas Stadium.
Yeah.
So UCLA is literally borrowing Texas Stadium from the Cowboys. And by the way, the Cowboys were horrible that season of 1988. The Cowboys were 3-13. They were horrible. Mm-hmm. And so they needed a quarterback, and they were going to have the first round or the first pick in the NFL draft because they had the worst record. So Troy Aikman is out there working out every day, and it was perfectly legal to do it and so forth. But a guy in a funny hat showed up and watched him work out every day, and that guy would have been whom?
Tom Landry?
That would have been Tom Landry. So Tom Landry personally scouts Troy Aikman, and he's out there to find his quarterback, his franchise quarterback of the future. Okay, so that's kind of how that impacts, at least initially, the draft. But then something else happens. The dates get a little bit interesting. So Landry scouted Troy Aikman in January of 1989. So people get really confused in football because a lot of postseason stuff happens in a new calendar year. But the regular season of 88 and therefore the postseason of 1989, the Cotton Bowl was on January the 2nd, 1989 in Dallas. Landry, as of January 1st, 1989, is scouting Troy Aikman to make him the first pick in the draft, presumably. However, what Tom Landry did not know was going on, and here's our other huge Arkansas thread, is you want to guess what happened in February of 89? Which would have been my senior year of high school, the spring or the winter, and a really big thing happened.
Jerry Jones buys the Cowboys.
Jerry Jones bought the Cowboys in February, or at least it was public by February. I don't know when it was finalized and all that. And so Jerry bought the team in February. The draft is in April, and he fires Tom Landry. He flies all the way to Austin to fire Tom Landry, and he hires Jimmy Johnson. So there's your two major Arkansas threads for the 1989 Cotton Bowl. Is not only was Arkansas as a team playing in it, but Jerry Jones that entire time was negotiating in earnest to buy the Cowboys franchise. Okay, so let's get back to the game itself. It was on January 2nd, 1989. UCLA, I think I said this, maybe not. They were the first team from the Pac-10 to play in the Cotton Bowl since the 1940s. So it wasn't a normal occurrence for a Pac-10 team to come that far east and play in the middle part of the country at the Cotton Bowl. Also, another little interesting historical part of this is that UCLA had won 6, I believe, consecutive bowl games leading into that game, which is phenomenal. I mean, just from lately, you can think of upsets that happened in bowl games and stuff, and how hard that would be to do. But they were rolling. I mean, back then, 9-2 was nothing to sneeze at, and the bowls were so structured, and there was no playoff. So UCLA had a really good program. They sent a lot of guys to the pros back then, and they were working towards their 7th consecutive bowl championship, which was just unheard of. So like I said, to rewind and reset the story up, Dallas, Texas, January 1989, UCLA is 9-2 and ranked, let's say, in the top 15. Arkansas is 10-1 and ranked in exactly at number 10, depending on what poll you saw. Okay, Dylan, do you want to take a stab at who won the game?
UCLA.
UCLA won the game, and do you have any idea what the score? I remember watching this game just like it was yesterday. Not that I remember all the details, but I definitely remember watching the game. Do you have any idea what the score was?
I do, because I looked it up on my phone, and it's absolutely disgusting football.
Why was it disgusting football?
It was 17-8.
17-3, I thought.
Well, it says 17-8, but it was an awful game.
I think it was 17-3. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I don't know who I watched it with, but I watched it. And so I was a senior in high school, so obviously this was something I was into. It probably was with my dad, and I remember probably with your Uncle Casey, and I remember everyone in the room saying this was one of the worst football games they'd ever watched in their lives. And the reason is because there was just no offense in this game. It was atrocious, man. And there were some reasons behind that. Two really different styles of play, for one thing. I mean, I don't know how many teams Arkansas played that were probably as good at throwing the ball and so forth, or at least being balanced. The Southwest Conference was still a pretty run-heavy league. And so you had two clashing philosophies for sure on offense. But something else happened that kind of made the score, at least on Arkansas' side, be low. Do you have any idea what that was?
If I had to guess with how low it was, because it was 3 I just checked, but I'd have to say, was their quarterback hurt? Somebody got hurt?
No, there were 2 suspensions.
Oh, okay.
So Arkansas had Wayne Martin, who was a defensive end, and we'll talk about him when we talk about the '89 draft. Mm-hmm. But he was a dominant player. He was an NFL player. He and their offensive tackle, probably the biggest guy on the field, was a guy named Freddie Childress from Arkansas. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is I had met him that summer before at a football camp, and he was the biggest human being I think I'd ever stood beside at that point. And Freddie and Wayne Martin somehow, no one knows to this day, I guess, what they did, but probably broke curfew or something, and Coach Hatfield suspended them both for the game. And so you lost your best offensive tackle and you lost your best defensive end. So really, in the trenches, it probably was a lot different story than it should have been. And I thought I scribbled them down somewhere, and I guess I did not. But Aikman did not really have that incredible of a game either. I guess Atwater and company did a good job in the secondary, because I want to say Aikman only threw for 160 or 70 yards or something. But so it was an awful game to watch. Arkansas could do absolutely nothing on offense. And to be honest, Arkansas had a great defense that year. To be honest, UCLA couldn't do much better, and it's probably, the number 1 quarterback in the draft being on their team made a difference. But yeah, it was an atrocious, ugly game. So Wayne Martin and Freddie Childress were suspended by Hatfield, and Arkansas goes on to lose the 1989 Cotton Bowl by a whopping score of 17-3 to Troy Aikman, and there's probably several names on the UCLA team that I could mention if I looked them up, but I just know they had a lot of talent on that team as well. And UCLA ended up with their 7th consecutive bowl game. And I don't know if that's a record to this day or not, but it certainly was.
I looked it up, and at the time it was, and it was eventually broken by Florida State later. But at the time it was a record.
Oh, at the time? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, good. Boy, I tell you, when I looked up Aikman, there was a whole lot of stuff about his early life in high school and college that was really interesting. Better baseball player than most people probably think. Just the way that he went to Oklahoma and then transferred, and just all the story behind that's pretty interesting to me. Of course, I'm a big Aikman guy. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you some of the names on Arkansas's team, just for fans out there who are straining to try to remember, because this was a long time ago. But Barry Foster was a running back on that team for Arkansas. Mm-hmm. Quinn Grovey was the quarterback on that team for Arkansas. There was a running back that I very much remember named Juju Harshaw on that team. There was a running back that I very much remember named James Rouse on that team. There was a wide receiver on that team that I remember named Derek Russell. Derek Russell was from here in Little Rock, I believe Little Rock Central. And Derek Russell had a nice little career of probably 6-7 years with the Broncos mostly. Good receiver. Steve Atwater was on that team for Arkansas, as we've mentioned. And Wayne Martin and Freddie Childress, who I've already mentioned. And Arkansas had a really good kicker named Kendall Traynor. Have you ever heard of him?
I actually think I have.
Yeah, I think he won. Man, I hope it was Traynor. He won a bowl game for him, I want to say, during that stretch. Maybe it was him. Wayne's probably mad at me for not knowing that for sure, but I want to say Kendall Traynor won a bowl game with a field goal. Okay, so that's kind of the story. That's the background story to the 1989 NFL draft, and I just thought it was interesting. It would make its own episode to pull in the Arkansas connections and set the stage for what all was going on when the topic that you wanted to talk about originally rolled around, which was in April. So 4 months later when the NFL draft, and by the way, the NFL draft was not the event then that it is now whatsoever. And
that was the pre-Mel Kiper days.
That was he might have been on there already, but the hype for it, it was not a full week, full court press, event like it is now for sure. So anyway.
Well, he was the only person that attended too. Troy Aikman. He was the only player that went there.
Yeah, thanks for stealing my very first comment out of the next episode when we talk about that. But yes, we'll talk about that for the episode, for the 1989 draft episode. So yeah, the Cotton Bowl of 1989, it was a good story for Arkansas fans. It was a good story for Cowboys fans. It was a good story for NFL fans. And it led to the way that the dominoes fell for that whole season and how the bowl game came to be. It influenced a whole lot of history for 2 or 3 programs in the pros and college there. So I thought it was very interesting. And like I said, it's really weird how when we talk about these things, so many things run through, so many threads seem to run through Arkansas. So what do you think about that? Pretty good topic?
That's a pretty good topic. And what's really jarring is I forgot that back then you couldn't declare for the draft as a junior.
Yeah.
Like nowadays, there's not a single senior quarterback would play in a bowl game.
Right.
Especially the post Jalen Smith era where they're literally afraid they're going to, blow their knee up and not play anymore.
Right.
So that's pretty crazy. And I didn't know about that 1988 Heisman race where those 2 quarterbacks, Rodney Peete and Troy Aikman, were the front runners.
I had a Sports Illustrated from back then that had the 2 of them on the cover. And even if Pete wasn't I'm pretty sure they were both being pushed for the Heisman, but even if not, they were pushing Aikman for it, and Pete was being pushed as still a premier guy because of being the quarterback of USC, and they had a good team. So I think I'm going to end this episode right here, and we're going to film or record our next episode, and it will be about the 1989 draft. But let's end episode 8, the 1989 Cotton Bowl, right there. Thanks for being a part of it, buddy.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.